A cold, early spring day in the Bohemian Greenwich village, March 6, 1970. It was almost noon when an explosion rocked West 11th Street, bringing a townhouse down in on itself. It brought chaos to the neighborhood, even destroying the home of actor Dustin Hoffman. While the firefighters put out the flames, 2 survivors escaped the wreckage. As they searched the rubble, they found not just more bodies, but 60 sticks of dynamite, an anti-tank shell, blasting caps, and several prepared explosive devices, capped with the nails to cause as much damage as possible to victims. In truth, the townhouse had been used as a hideout in a bomb-making factory by an underground, left-wing terrorist group known as the Weather Underground. The roots of the Weather Underground go back to a left-wing activist group known as Students for a Democratic Society, aka SDS. Formed in the early 60s, the ideological path that the SDS would take was emblematic of that era. This was an era when the idealism of JFK transitioned into cynicism and anger as LBJ escalated the war in Vietnam. Bob Dylan's 1965 single, The Times They Are A-Changin', laid bare the bubbling resentment of the youth as their hopes for the future turned sour.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
The Tet Offensive rocked the remaining confidence that the American political establishment had in the war. While the actual goals of the Tet Offensive failed, it showed the American public that the Viet Cong were very much not finished. Some months later, the anti-war politician Eugene McCarthy's overperformance in the New Hampshire primary and the sudden entrance of RFK into the primaries knocked LBJ's re-election campaign flat. Soon, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, would enter the race in his stead. Amid this growing domestic crisis, the first major campus protests would occur at Columbia University in New York City. The Columbia University protest stemmed from a construction of a gym with separate entrances for students and people from the primarily black neighborhood near the university, leading to allegations of segregation. Things went wild, with both students and locals mobilizing against the gym. White radicals tried to take over the campus and occupy the Columbia president's office. They left the black radicals to focus on stopping the building of the gym itself. SDS members Mark Rudd, John Jacobs, and Tom Hayden all played important roles in the Columbia protests. In the future, all of them would become major national leaders for the SDS, with Rudd and Jacobs becoming Weather Underground leaders. While these protests were a little bit radical, no one was hurt. There was still hope and things could be changed peacefully. A few days later, while in Memphis, Tennessee, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The news spread fast, and while many liberal leaders called for calm, chaos was inevitable. The riots were a culmination of anger that had been building up for decades by that point. A man of peace had been murdered in broad daylight. Entire city blocks burnt and wouldn't recover for decades in some cases. Over the course of a week, 43 were killed, 3,000 were wounded, and some 20,000 were arrested all over the country. This sudden outpouring of grief and rage scared many white people in America, playing right into the hands of Richard Nixon with his new brand of law and order politics. Nixon promised to bring back the sensible time before all of the chaos and crack down on the long-hair hippie types. As America burnt down and the Vietnam War continued on, RFK won primary after primary. Humphrey still had the backing of the party's bigwigs, but RFK was putting up a hell of a fight. Soon, he was in striking distance and could secure the nomination at the convention in Chicago. RFK gave a speech at the Ambassador Hotel, thanking his supporters and stating that he was hopeful for Chicago. While he was going through the passageway through the hotel's kitchen, he shook hands with waiter Juan Romero. It was at this moment that Sirhan Sirhan rushed up to RFK and fired away at point-blank range. Now, whatever idealism there was left over from those heady Kennedy days of the early 60s, it had finally been extinguished. Now there was anger, resentment, apathy, and terror. SDS had been taking all of this in, growing more and more radical with each passing day. When protests were planned by the Yippies and other anti-war groups at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, SDS's radicals didn't show up. SDS was a collective of different groups on different campuses, and their overall politics was quite varied. Some were more moderate, like Tom Hayden, and others were more radical, like Bill Ayers. With the victory of Nixon and his new brand of law and order politics, things looked more grim than ever for the new left. People were starting to feel revolutionary, and the SDS was careening towards a massive and unavoidable split. Since the mid-1960s, the Maoist Progressive Labour Party had infiltrated the SDS and had begun to grow in power. They were focused almost solely on class, putting labor above the growing interest in race on the left. The anti-Progressive Labour Party faction became known as the Revolutionary Youth Movement, but there were others who wanted to go even further. These figures saw the Black Power movement as deeply important. They even supported the secession of blacks from the US if they desired it, viewing the status of black Americans in the US as akin to a colony. In general, they supported foreign communist movements, especially Cuba and Vietnam, who they felt would be a part of the international vanguard against international capitalism and imperialism. More than class, the experiences working in the field and the civil rights movement had tilted the mainstream SDS towards the struggle against anti-black racism, even to the point of believing that addressing women's issues was racist and would take away focus liberating black people. They also believed that whites were a privileged class in society and that the white working class was to be ignored as they were hopelessly racist and reactionary. This was a period before intersectionality, apparently. This radical group also believed that black people should have their own segregated groups to lead forward the revolution. Whites would just follow along for the ride. They were considered very white saviory, even for the time. On June 18th, 1969, at the sometimes rock venue, the Chicago Coliseum, the SDS had a national convention. Things very quickly got rough, with the Progressive Labour Party's faction and the Revolutionary Youth Movement butting heads. The majority of SDS delegates at the convention backed the Revolutionary Youth Movement. John Jacobs and several others produced a document that outlined their views, with Terry Robbins suggesting the title, "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows," from a Bob Dylan song. However, with the release of this manifesto, the outright refusal to try and reach out to the white working class angered some. This other group believed that they could reach out and build class consciousness with them. They formed the Revolutionary Youth Movement, too. Very original name, I know. That was something that would take place later. At the time, it was still the PLP, the Progressive Labour Party, and the Revolutionary Youth Movement, essentially in two factions. These factions were at each other's throats, each accused of the other of different things ranging from distorting Marxism to racism or even sexism. In addition to this, somehow, despite having a strong majority, the anti-Progressive Labour Party faction was unable to secure control of the convention. Future head honcho weatherwoman Bernardine Dohrn made a demand that the Progressive Labour Party faction be removed from the SDS. When this demand was rejected, the majority of the delegates left with Dohrn and the others. The SDS had essentially collapsed. John Jacobs and others strongly supported immediate action over forming a mass movement. He termed the phrase, "bring the war home," and they were eager to do exactly that. However, some organizing of the new group was needed after the split. Collectives were formed, and all the income was placed in common for the leadership to use at their discretion. Individuals like Mike Rudd and John Jacobs went around to the different collectives to identify people they felt were politically unreliable. These people would then be subject to struggle sessions to break them down or to force them out, whichever was easier. This was also when the anti-monogamy campaign started. For whatever reason, the Weather Underground thought that monogamy was reactionary, so they launched a Smash Monogamy campaign. This resulted in women being shared by the collective, typically for the benefit of the men who ran these collectives. This abuse of authority towards women and their refusal to address women's issues resulted in the future Weather Underground being alienated from feminists. Left with some 300 members nationally after the convention, members started to make moves. They engaged in what were called jailbreaks, where members would charge into high schools and make a ruckus to agitate and recruit. Few joined. On the 6th of October, several months after the convention, Bill Ayers and several others in the Chicago cell blew up the statue for the policemen killed in the 1886 Haymarket Affair. This was their first bombing, but far from their last. 2 days later, John Jacobs' call to bring the war home would finally be acted upon. A group of people assembled in Chicago's Lincoln Park. They had helmets on, steel-toed boots, and some even had weapons. There were hopes for a huge turnout, and a lot of effort had been put into advertising, but all told, some 350 showed up. In spite of the small turnout, John Jacobs pushed the attendees further and further and advocated for violence. On the utterance of the code word, Marion Delgado, named after a 5-year-old who had derailed a train with a piece of concrete, the group began their riot. The days of rage had begun. They smashed random car windows, windows of homes and businesses, and even beat on random passerbys. It was just chaos and senseless violence. Within 40 minutes, they met heavy police opposition, so they broke off and turned tail. There were some 75 arrests, 21 officers and many others wounded, including several shot by the police. Afterwards, the national leadership began self-criticism sessions on themselves. The days of rage were embarrassing for the group. Attempts to keep the protests going continued over the following few days, but they were unsuccessful. Roughly $2.1 million in modern US dollars was paid out as bail. This was tough given that the SDS remnants were almost always close to bankrupt in spite of the leadership taking pretty much anything that came in financially. Many important leadership figures for the group had either been arrested or had jumped bail, so the organization's leadership had to go underground. A few days later on the 15th, the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam was undertaken. Anti-war types organized a massive march in DC to demand an end to the war. Hundreds of thousands were in the capital. Nixon just stated that he had the support of the silent majority. Not long after that, information about the My Lai massacre was revealed. This resulted in a second moratorium to end the war in Vietnam. This second march was even larger, with some estimating that there were almost 1 million people marching in DC against the war and against Nixon. However, the silent majority remained firm in their support for President Nixon. Increasingly, it felt like there were only two sides in America, the squares and the counterculture. There was no room for moderation or dialogue. All while people protested, our friends in the Weather Underground bombed the Harvard Center for International Affairs. Okay, not friends, but you get the idea. Now, this might seem like a random target, but the Weather Underground hated anyone who, quote, played pig by working for imperialism. They criticized active soldiers, veterans, teachers, and so on as being irredeemable. This was yet more self-defeating purity politics that seriously limited their reach. Other New Left outfits at the time eagerly reached out to US soldiers, but the Weather Underground was no good. During this time, the Americans began to depart for Cuba as part of the Venceremos Brigade. Some of these figures were Weather Underground members and met North Vietnamese representatives, who asked them to engage in armed action against the US government. They accepted funding and training from Cuba to further this task. Then the Chicago Police Department assassinated Black Panther leader Fred Hampton. This might as well have been a declaration of war as far as the Weather Underground was concerned. While they retaliated by bombing police vehicles, Weather Underground had more radical plans. On the 27th of December, the group held a war council in Flint, Michigan at an inner-city dance hall. On the walls, they plastered photos of radical leaders like Malcolm X, Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, and Fred Hampton alongside slogans like Sirhan Power. They even hung up a picture of Sharon Tate with a papier-mâché bullet, celebrating her recent murder. The event proved to be a strange mix of rage-fueled speeches, pre-love sex party, and strategy meeting. A number of speeches were given with various members speaking about how bloodthirsty they were. Bernardine Dohrn praised the Manson family. Dig it. First they killed those pigs, then they ate dinner in the room with them. Then they even shoved a fork into Pig Tate's stomach. Wild. Parents are now going to tell their kids to stay away from home vacation. They're afraid they'll get offed in their sleep. What a normal thing to say. A strategy meeting was conducted behind closed doors by the leadership. They decided to go underground to engage in armed struggle, focusing on attacking the sites of power for international imperialism. They also decided to dissolve the SDS and reform themselves as the Weather Underground organization. They refused to form or lead a mass organization above ground. Instead, regions would have their own underground collectives. John Jacobs finished the War Council with a speech to further rile up the members. We will burn and loot and destroy. We are the incubation of your mother's nightmare. Jacobs wasn't just predicting a civil war. He was eager and giddy at the prospect of bloodshed. And as one of the two leaders in the New York City collective for the Weather Underground, John Jacobs and Terry Robbins were eager to start the armed struggle. Struggle sessions continued after the War Council, now heavily using LSD to discover police spies. This didn't work. Barry Grathwohl got in. Grathwohl would have his cover blown by the FBI later on, thus leaving the Weather Underground as free of spies.
I brought up the subject of what's going to happen after we take over the government. We become responsible then for administrating, 250 million people. And there was no answers. No one had given any thought to economics. How are you going to clothe and feed these people? The only thing that I could get was that they expected that the Cubans and the North Vietnamese and the Chinese and the Russians would all want to occupy different portions of the United States. They also believed that their immediate responsibility would be to protect against what they called the counter-revolution. And they felt that this counter-revolution could best be guarded against by creating and establishing re-education centers in the Southwest, where we would take all the people who needed to be re-educated into the new way of thinking and teach them how things were going to be. I asked, well, what is going to happen to those people that we can't re-educate, that are die-hard capitalists? And the reply was that they'd have to be eliminated. And when I pursued this further, they estimated that they would have to eliminate 25 million people in these re-education centers. And when I say eliminate, I mean kill. 25 million people. I want you to imagine sitting in a room with 25 people, most of which have graduate degrees from Columbia and other well-known educational centers, and hear them figuring out the logistics for the elimination of 25 million people. And they were dead serious.
They launched a pair of attacks, the first being a bombing of a police HQ in San Francisco, and the New York City cell tossed Molotov cocktails at the home of a judge. These attacks did little to affect the political situation in the country. The head of the New York City cell, Terry Robbins, wasn't satisfied. He wanted something on a larger scale, something that would make a change. Robbins found out that another New York City cell member, Kathy Wilkerson's father, was an ad executive and owned a townhouse in Greenwich Village. Wilkerson was able to convince her father to allow her to stay there while he was out of town on vacation. The New York City Collective moved right on in and made it their home. Terry Robbins very quickly began to plan for a massive attack, focusing on a non-commissioned officer's dance at Fort Dix. They went out and bought dynamite and electric fuses before starting to work on explosive construction, though none of them had any experience or formal training in bomb making. Everyone had different reactions as Robbins charged forward. Another cell member, Kathy Bodin, suggested to maximize casualties. Wilkerson and another cell member, Diana Oughton, reportedly had misgivings. Robbins continued forward all the same, constructing the weapon without much knowledge about what he was doing. March 6, 1970. Early in the morning, Ted Gold had went out to buy cotton balls but would be returning soon. Kathy Wilkerson was upstairs ironing and Bodin was taking a shower. Wilkerson then heard a roaring sound from the basement bomb factory and saw the floor break into several pieces. A second explosion caused the floor to collapse in on itself. The pair of explosions had rocked the neighborhood, blowing out the windows and leaving dogs barking. Fire had already begun to spread into remains of the home. Diana Oughton and Terry Robbins had been killed in the blast. Ted Gold had been crushed by fallen beams. Soon, Kathy Wilkerson regained consciousness covered in soot next to the crater where the basement used to be. Wilkerson saw Bodin and the two fled the building just before another explosion which further damaged the home of actor Dustin Hoffman. The soot-covered Wilkerson and nude Bodin fled the townhouse and were briefly taken in by the neighbor. Both women would then escape and go underground, remaining on the run for the next decade. The detective on the scene noted that the blast was stronger than a gas explosion, which was the initial theory. He then called his superior, Albert A. Seidman. Seidman got into contact with the FBI, who told him that Wilkerson was a member of a group called the Weather Underground Organization. The gas leak theory was quickly discarded. Soon they discovered the body of Ted Gold, and the excavation continued, discovering the body of Diana Oughton. He had been blasted with roofing nails, ironically intended to be used on their targets. The body of Robbins would be found later on. Then they found the bomb that Oughton and Robbins had been building. It was a basketball-sized ball of blasting caps and dynamite that had been packed with roofing nails. Seidman later said that it would have destroyed the entire block if it had been detonated. The bomb squad continued searching, finding a live anti-tank shell, 57 dynamite sticks, 4 pipe bombs, and 30 blasting caps in a partridge in a pear tree. It was a bomb factory. The explosion had not just destroyed the townhouse, it had also devastated the New York City cell. Mark Rudd would later end up being demoted for his failings, and then John Jacobs fled into exile in Canada, Jacobs died in exile, and Rudd is currently a mathematics professor in New Mexico. The Weather Underground members would later claim that they never targeted people or intended to cause casualties. This is a lie, but the explosion in Greenwich Village did seriously change the Weather Underground's tactics and damaged their reputation with the far left. Following this, over the course of the next few months, the Midwestern cells of Weather Underground were taken down. The Chicago bomb-making factory was raided, and with the help of FBI informant Larry Grathwohl, the Cincinnati cell's leader was rounded up and arrested, and many others were also arrested alongside them. Slowly disintegrating and bereft of legitimacy, the Weather Underground was starting to look like it was going to be finished before it had even started. April 29, 1970. The Cambodian campaign begins. The sudden invasion provoked anger with the anti-war crowd, who plotted out a nationwide student strike against the incursion in Cambodia, set to kick off on May Day. On the second day of the strike, on May 2nd, at Kent State University, the ROTC building was burnt down. The situation there had been getting out of control, and the National Guard were going to be deployed there to rein in the striking students. On the 4th of May, the National Guard was met by protesting students at Kent State. The students were rowdy, but nothing that the National Guard wasn't expecting or used to. However, instead of holding their ground, the National Guard wheeled around to face the students and began to shoot. The initial volley killed 4 students and wounded many others. It was a massacre, and even stranger, Middle America cheered it on. Similar events resulting in the murder of protesters across the country happened. However, given that the victims of these events were often black, they were largely ignored by the press at the time. This provoked an extreme anger among the students in the New Left, and the student strike protests grew even more radical and large, encompassing more than 4 million students and some 450 educational institutions. 30 ROTC buildings were burnt down, and the Weather Underground bombed the National Guard Association in Washington, D.C. People were angry, and not just the students. Middle America was also angry too. The Hard Hat riot in New York City demonstrated how deeply alienated the white working class had grown with the American left. The pro-business Nixon donned the hard hat and promised the Archie Bunkers of America that he was going to crack down on those hippy-dippy, pot-smoking commies. Weather Underground was happy with how things were progressing towards radicalism and civil war, but if it was going to be a war, the Weather Underground wanted it to be formal. Bernardine Dohrn wrote a declaration of war. Black people have been fighting almost alone for years. We've known that our job is to lead white kids into armed revolution. We never intended to spend the next 5 or 25 years of our lives in jail. Ever since the SDS became revolutionary, we've been trying to show how it is possible to overcome the frustration and impotence that comes with trying to reform this system. Kids know the lines are drawn. Revolution is touching all of our lives. Tens of thousands have learned that protest and marches don't do it. Revolutionary violence is the only way. What followed was one of the group's most active periods. The San Francisco Hall of Justice, the U.S. Army base at the Presidio in San Francisco, a Bank of America branch, and then the bank's headquarters in New York City. Bomb after bomb had went off, with the Weather Underground eager to regain the legitimacy that it had lost. They got that chance when they helped counterculture icon Timothy Leary escape from the U.S. Leary had been imprisoned at the minimum security California Men's Colony prison after a long string of legal issues. Leary escaped by traversing a long cable that had been suspended over the institution's fence and was driven to a point where the Weather Underground was waiting for him. Weather Underground helped him by driving him first to the far south, and then to Northern California to confuse the police. Then he was brought to Algeria with dyed hair, fresh clothes, and a fake identity. This is where the Black Panther Party's government in exile had been set up by Cleaver. The announcement that Weather Underground helped Leary escape into exile was very well received by people on the left and among hippies. The fact that Weather Underground was actually paid to do this by a gang of hippies, rather than doing this out of their own volition, would be revealed much later on. As if resetting the clock, the Haymarket Police Monument in Chicago was bombed for a second time. The Weather Underground was back on the scene. The next target was to be the Marin County Courthouse. This was done in revenge for the death of Jonathan Jackson and the escaped prisoners. Jackson was the younger brother of Black Guerrilla family founder George Jackson. George Jackson was one of the Soledad brothers, who murdered prison guard John Vincent Mills at Soledad Prison in retaliation for the shooting of 3 black prisoners by a different prison guard. For whatever reason on the left, the Soledad brothers became a cause célèbre, or more simply put, a very popular cause to support. To make a long story short, George Jackson's 17-year-old younger brother Jonathan was given guns by Angela Davis, and he attempted to take hostages to release his brother. Jonathan Jackson died in the resulting gun battle alongside 2 escaped prisoners and Judge Haley, who he had taken hostage. 3 others were also wounded. This was followed by a pair of bombs in the New York City area, but the most important attack of 1970 was at the Harvard Center for International Affairs. Again, this was done in retaliation for the arrest of Angela Davis in connection to the prior incident that I just mentioned. Though what makes it important is that this wasn't actually done by the Weather Underground, but rather the, and I quote, Proud Eagle Tribe of Weather. This was an all-woman group assembled by Bernardine Dohrn, who opposed the sexist methods of many Weather Underground leaders. She wanted to change them and refocus the struggle of feminists away from women's lib at home to women's liberation of Vietnam. Get it? Dohrn was subsequently put on the FBI's most wanted list, and gender grew more equalized inside the group. Weather Underground was settling some of its internal issues, and soon the all-woman group just became the Women's Brigade of Weather Underground rather than the weird racist name. However, throughout all of this, there was a steady trickle of arrests. In December of 1970 alone, a rash of arrests resulted in 9 members ending up behind bars. The Weather Underground hemorrhaged membership as the anti-war movement slowed down and the prospects of revolution grew dim. In March of 1971, they bombed the Capitol building. This was yet another well-received attack by the scraggly remnants of the New Left, significantly shrunken from their revolutionary days of 1968. A few days later, something more important happened, however. The Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania. They uncovered a program called COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was a series of illegal programs undertaken by the FBI since 1956 against groups that the feds didn't like. Any group Hoover didn't like would be monitored, infiltrated, and destroyed. While initially newspapers refused to publish this information, ultimately, the Washington Post broke the story, and the other papers had to follow suit. August 21st, 1971. George Jackson, the aforementioned founder of the Black Guerrilla family, was killed during a prison escape attempt. Weather Underground responded by bombing the office of the California prison system in Sacramento and San Francisco. The following month in September, the Attica prison riots occurred. The prisoners demanded better treatment for themselves, but ultimately, the police killed many prisoners and the hostages. As if by clockwork, the Weather Underground bombed the New York Department of Corrections in Albany a few days later. A little less than a month afterwards, they bombed the office of analyst William Bundy for his work with the CIA and US government in Southeast Asia. They followed this up by bombing the Pentagon on Ho Chi Minh's birthday, the 19th of May. This would be the first and last bombing of 1972. The cooling down of US involvement in the war in Vietnam, the many arrests, and general wearing down of morale had begun to have a serious effect on the Weather Underground. They slowed considerably. For the first time in a long time, the 1973 ceasefire between the US and North Vietnam gave the Weather Underground the opportunity to address its stance towards women. By the way, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dohrn are married, so it's hard to say how much she would have been able to do without Ayers' approval. Dohrn created a document entitled Mountain Moving Day that tried to right the ship for them. In particular, Dohrn levied heavy criticism on the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, that they described as akin to the Bureau of Indian Affairs for its coercive effects on women. I can't believe I'm saying this, but they kind of had a point here. Not the comparison to the Bureau of Indian Affairs or whatever, but there was something to be said about the HEW's approach to sterilization. At that time, sterilization of the poor or people deemed not mentally fit wasn't uncommon on the state level, and by the 1970s, the federal government had begun to offer family planning, and as part of the family planning they offered sterilization. Critics said that lax regulations resulted in coerced sterilizations of poor and minority women. Ultimately, reforms to the system resolved most of the potential issues with this by 1978. Granted, the Weather Underground didn't even do much. Even when they bombed the HEW's offices in San Francisco, the people who protested legally and provided concise arguments of their concerns were the ones who changed things for the better. The brand of politics of the Weather Underground was entirely performative. Not long after this, a collective letter to the women's movement was released by the Women's Brigade of the Weather Underground. This was their attempt to engage with the growing radical feminist current in the country. It was also their chance to denounce Jane Alpert, former radical communist who had briefly been sheltered by the Weather Underground before turning towards feminism. None of these efforts seemed to pay off, though. The Weather Underground had already had an awful reputation with feminists. 1973 was a good year for the Weather Underground, not because of anything they did, but rather because Nixon was in hot water. With the Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon attempted to dismiss Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, the impeachment process began. Nixon had laid his cards on the table, and he had failed.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything.
In that same month, the revelation of COINTELPRO and a court decision regarding federal electronic surveillance statutes, typically referred to as Title III, resulted in a lot of evidence against Weather Underground members being tossed out. In the US, evidence that was obtained illegally can't be used in court, fruit of the poisonous tree and all that. So many cases were rendered simply unprosecutable. Now a lot of members were facing trial for time behind bars for maybe a couple years. So the Weather Underground would start to return back above ground.
Marianne, all vestiges of the turbulent 60s are now just a page in history. That's what former members of the Weather Underground are saying after the surrender of Bernardine Dohrn and William Ayers last week. The heyday of those young radicals began in 1969. The times have changed, and so have the attitudes of the young, as our Diane Lawson found out.
10 years ago, Bernardine Dohrn was shouting revolution. This administration building was held and occupied by students for 3 weeks. Could it happen today? Probably not.
Chicago sounded the death knell, that there is no one left. But the FBI does not agree, although agents have given up intense hunts for the radicals.
This presented Weather Underground with a new opportunity to reassess its politics. In 1974, the group published a book entitled Prairie Fire: The Politics of Revolutionary Anti-Imperialism. The book was the synthesis of what the group had been through and how going underground without a legal mass party to support them was a mistake. It didn't renounce revolutionary violence, as it believed it both necessary and inevitable, but it also advocated for a focus on peaceful methods to create a base of support which could in turn build a powerful underground organization. The book was even dedicated to some 200 figures, including Sirhan Sirhan. Some things just never change. To the surprise of everybody, no doubt, the book was well received, and some 50,000 copies were distributed. However, not everybody was happy with that approach, and they began to splinter, making the already tiny group even more minuscule and unimportant. One of the sticking points was an increased interest in workplace organizing. For whatever reason, much of Weather Underground's base of support thought it was anathema to their cause, which is like the most absurd thing for a socialist to argue. While the Weather Underground did 2 more bomb attacks in DC, it was already 1975 and the Vietnam War was ending. Saigon was falling, and the Weather Underground was collapsing. The ugly reality of growing older as underground guerrillas weighed heavily on many of the Weather Underground members, and so they continued with their Prairie Fire Organizing Committee plan. The organization was formally created in July of 1975, alongside an accompanying magazine entitled Breakthrough. They were eager to rebuild their connection to the left wing in the US, and so they created a national conference entitled Hard Times. Numerous leftist organizations were invited, and things seemed promising, with Bernardine Dohrn hoping to formulate a national platform for the left in the 1970s. But most of the delegates ended up getting together into a non-white caucus and collectively accusing Weather Underground of being sexist and racist for supporting workplace organizing, which they said placed labor above race and gender in the struggle. The holier-than-thou white saviors had been called out. In the wake of all of this controversy, Bernardine Dohrn claimed that supporting workplace organizing was opportunist, white supremacist analysis, and said that this change was the, quote, classic path of the white so-called revolutionaries who sold out the revolution. Yeah, don't focus on the workers, just leave them by the wayside, see what happens. This results in splits to the organization. One of the splinter groups bombed an Immigration and Naturalization Service office and then attempted to bomb the office of homophobic California State Senator John Briggs. Instead, they were arrested in an FBI sting operation. It was revealed that the organization was overrunning with police spies. The attempt to bomb the office of John Briggs was the last attempt from the Weather Underground to bring forth revolutionary violence. People began to emerge from the underground in the late 70s, and with a more radical and violent group forming the May 19th Communist Organization. By 1985, however, all but one of the members of that organization were serving time behind bars for their crimes. The Weather Underground went defunct, and the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee has been seemingly inactive for well over a decade at this point. Since the Weather Underground went defunct and its members came out of hiding, many have returned to a normal life of sorts, some of them engaging in what I would call whitewashing of the organization's history. While helped by plenty of third parties, noted leader Bill Ayers has always been a big whitewasher. Bill Ayers always stated that he wasn't a terrorist and that the Weather Underground wasn't a terrorist organization because it didn't kill innocent civilians. In reality, if the townhouse hadn't blown up, you would have been targeting innocents in your attacks, and the ones you did do were close to random in many cases. And it's not like these were cherry bombs and toilet seers, these were full-force bombs that could have easily taken lives if things went wrong. Really, it's quite impressive how many of these ex-terrorists just went about having normal lives afterwards. Many of them worked in academia, one even worked in law afterwards. Seriously. Quite a few of them were also born with silver spoons in their mouths, so it's not like they needed to care too much about money anyway. Now, criticism is easy. Do I think that I would have taken some of the same paths they took if I was in their shoes? No, definitely not. The difference between righteous anger and bloodthirst can be thin sometimes. When all of the conflicts that the Weather Underground involved itself in, how many times did they positively affect the outcome of it? I can't think of any. Just don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Comment, like, subscribe, share the video, and check out my Twitch or gaming YouTube channel. All links are in the description. Thank you very much. Without any further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.